Hi, my name is Lucy Lintott and I am an invasive species consultant scientist at APEM. APEM is an environmental consultancy with a team of specialist scientists focused on invasive species. Today I will be giving you a brief introduction to marine invasive species and their impacts, as well as some specific examples and problems from here in the Solent. So first of all, let's understand the differences between the different terms. A native species is one that originated and developed in its current habitat. In other words, it belongs here. It usually causes no harm, but it can be a nuisance under certain conditions. An example of this might be the native species of the seaweed ulva, which can form big blooms or green tides, which can clog up harbours and waterways. Next, we have the non-native species, which are those that originate from elsewhere and have been introduced into the area they live in now. This introduction is usually as a result of human activity. These species, although they don't belong here, do not cause any noticeable negative impacts on the ecosystem or to the humans living there. Finally, we come to invasive species. Approximately 10 to 15% of non-native species cause ecological or socio-economic harm. In other words, it doesn't belong here and it causes a problem. This might be because it outcompetes or predates on native species, which can lead to a loss of biodiversity, or it might foul equipment or infrastructure, requiring cleaning, removal and maintenance, which can be costly. Today, we'll be focusing on this group. So let's go through some potential impacts from invasive species. Generally, they have both ecological and socioeconomic impacts. They can impact biodiversity through competition and predation, as we've already discussed. They can also alter gene pools through hybridization. For example, the native mussel and the European mussel have interbred. They can alter habitats. For example, Pacific oysters and slipper limpets can form areas of hard surfaces, changing the existing structure of the seabed, beach or intertidal area. They can hamper restoration efforts by impeding seagrass and native oyster beds. And they can carry with them diseases and parasites that might be introduced to native species. They can negatively impact utilities and infrastructure, tourism and recreation, as well as fisheries and aquaculture. And it's estimated that between 1960 and 2020, in the EU alone, the management and control of invasive species cost 117 billion euros. So let's talk about how invasive species are spread in the marine environment. They spread via what is called a pathway or a vector. These pathways are the mechanisms by which invasive species are moved from one geographic location to be introduced into another. In the marine environment, numerous pathways exist and are specific to each area depending on the activities that take place there. One of the main pathways of spread in the marine environment is the movement of large vessels. These vessels, either commercial or military, have a large surface area below the water and niche areas that species can stow away. They travel around the globe, stopping in ports and harbours to transfer goods, as well as loading and unloading ballast water, making them the perfect vessel, if you will, for the spread of invasive species. It's undeniable that global shipping and trade has increased substantially over the last century. And as you can see from these figures, it is projected to increase further. Here are a few more examples of pathways in the marine environment. These include through biofouling on other sorts of vessels like passenger ferries or sailing boats. There can also be escape from shell fisheries or the release of live bait in angling, as well as beach renourishment where material is imported. We should also mention that marine species, invasive species, can also spread as a result of climate change, as increasing sea surface temperatures allow for the expansion of their habitat ranges. Some recent studies identified the Solent region, specifically Southampton and Portsmouth, as hotspot areas for vessel movements with data from marine traffic. This is for both recreational and commercial vessel movement here. Here you can see the intensity of both shipping and recreational boating in this region. and the area around the Solent as a very high intensity area of activity. A recent study also highlighted the central region, specifically Southampton and Portsmouth again, as having high numbers of non-native species. You might then surmise that with a high frequency of the pathway or high intensity of the pathway, you get more invasive species arriving at the site. All of the activities listed here take place in the Solent. For example, habitat restoration, harvesting of shellfish, and recreation. All of these activities are also at risk from the impacts of invasive species. You can see this in an example here on the right-hand side of the invasive carpet sea squirt, Didemnum vexillum, encrusting aquaculture equipment. Cleaning and maintaining this equipment is costly and demonstrates the potential economic issues associated with invasives in the Solent. As well as the impacts to businesses and human activity in the Solent, we're also concerned with ecosystem impacts. As you can see from this map, the Solent is a patchwork of protected areas and designated sites, with marine conservation zones, special areas of conservation, special protected areas, and offshore marine protected areas. These are vulnerable sites and habitats that need safeguarding against the threat of invasive species. Over the next few slides, I will share with you some species of concern for the Solent, many of which you'll probably be familiar with. So first of all, we have the slipper limpet, Crepidula fornicata, which is native to North America. It's been in the UK for a while. It was first recorded in 1872. It forms these very distinctive chains with the female on the bottom and the males on top. They compete for space with native species, and they can also alter substrate. So for example, you see in this photo at the bottom here, all of these hard shells that have piled up on this soft sediment beach. They are also very prolific and are listed as a result in the top 100 most invasive alien species in Europe. Next, we have the carpet sea squirt, or Didemnum vexillum, which was mentioned earlier. This is native to Japan, but it is now established in the Solent. It can grow over and smother native species, including seagrasses, thereby hampering the efforts of seagrass restoration, and it can foul infrastructure and equipment. Our survey team captured this image of the carpet sea squirt on the underside of a pontoon in Ireland. Now, there aren't very many signs here to show the size, the scale of the aggregation, but they can reach very large sizes. Next, we have the Pacific oyster, Magellana gigas, which is native to Japan and Northeast Asia. It was first introduced in the 60s for aquaculture as our native oyster populations were dwindling. However, they escaped from these shell fisheries and were recorded in the wild by 1965. They can form dense aggregations, which you can see in the photos here, which alter the seashore substrate and impact community composition. They can also be a human health hazard as people slip and fall and cut themselves pretty badly on the sharp shells. They outcompete native oysters for food and space as well, increasing the population pressure that they're already facing. Next, we have the trumpet tubeworm, Phycopomatus enigmaticus, which is native to the Indo-Pacific. As you can see from the photos, it's a really prolific fouler of boat hulls, equipment, and infrastructure. And it's a real nuisance in marinas where it can encrust lines and moorings and block pipes and tide gates. And once they've stuck to a surface, they're very hard to remove, so maintenance is very labour intensive and can be very costly. Next, we have Sargassum musicum, or wireweed, which is a brown seaweed native to Japan. It can outcompete natives for light, nutrients and space, especially in places like rock pools, where they grow densely over the top and stop light from entering the water. They can also foul fishing gear and block pipes. Lastly, we have the American lobster, or Homarus americanus, which is native to the northeastern coast of Canada and the USA. Now, this is different to the other species that we've covered in this presentation because it's not yet thought to be established in the UK and is considered a horizon species, or one to look out for. The sightings that have been made, which you can see in the map, are thought to be as a result of deliberately released or escaped animals. For example, in 2015, 361 lobsters were released as part of a ceremony in Brighton, and only a proportion of those were recovered. They are larger and more aggressive than the native European lobster, as well as highly fertile and tolerant of more habitats. They are therefore considered a serious risk to natives, as they can outcompete them for resources, interbreed, and spread diseases. Here we have a really fantastic poster that was prepared by IFCA to hand out to local fishers. This is to give distinguishing features between the American lobster and the European lobster so that they can be identified if caught, retained and reported to their local IFCA officer. There are several national legislative drivers to facilitate invasive species management, some of which you may be familiar with. For example, the UK Marine Strategy and the Wildlife and Countryside Act. For this region, there is the South Inshore and South Offshore Marine Plan, which outlines the policy for non-Indigenous species. It is that proposals must put in place appropriate measures to avoid or minimise significant adverse impacts on the marine area that would arise through the introduction and transport of non-Indigenous species, particularly when moving equipment, boats or livestock, or introducing structures suitable for settlement of non-Indigenous species. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed our whistle-stop tour of marine invasive species.